day, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Governance and Policy Podcast by the Adam Smith Center, Singapore's first and only organization promoting pro-market values. The aim of this podcast is educational and to underpin the importance of economics, public policy ideas, and the humanities in general. I'm Steffi, and I will be the host for today's discussion on inequality from the upcoming book Liberalism, Unveiled. We are joined by the two co-authors. The first is Brian Cheng, founder of the Adam Smith Center, and whose academic interests are found within politics, philosophy, and economics. The second is Donovan Choi, a visiting research fellow at the Adam Smith Center. The book Liberalism Unveiled, Forging a New Third Way in Singapore, offers a fresh, classical, liberal perspective into the Singapore political discourse. On today's podcast, Brian and Donovan will speak on the issue of inequality in Singapore. So the first question is, what are some of the concerns regarding inequality in Singapore at the moment?
Generally, the concern is that inequality is too high, and it's a very serious problem in Singapore and in many countries. And somehow people who are concerned about this, they also conclude with the idea that governments need to do more to intervene in the economy to achieve what they call social justice. And that involves policies such as universal welfare entitlements, minimum wage laws, redistribution of wealth and incomes. So these are the typical solutions that are recommended in this case. So, and I think the big problem that we see here is twofold, right? We need to assess what the problem is, what's inequality, and does that really require some governmental response? If so, what is the right response? So I think these are the considerations that we must have.
Yeah. So Brian is the academic, so maybe let me put it in very layman terms, right? I think there's, broadly speaking, when we talk about income inequality, there's this anxiety about the fact that a small population in the elites are controlling a majority of the wealth in the economy, and the 99% of wealth belongs to them, and the rest of the 99% of the population has just a very small amount of wealth. And I think if you read like popular op-eds, there's something, the sort of like the sentiment about this is that there's something troubling about that. How can Bill Gates have that much wealth? How can Jeff Bezos own 10 yachts when people are not struggling to get by? Yeah.
Okay, so Brian, you mentioned like a few terms. I think some of them were minimum wage, wealth taxes, redistribution, and universal welfare. Can you kind of go through each of them individually and also how they kind of link up to each other?
Sure. So the first one is that of the minimum wage. So that's usually a law passed by governments to prohibit firms and employers from paying their workers below a certain salary, right? So let's say, you are working in the economy and you earn a market wage of around $8 an hour or $9 an hour. So these social justice activists say it's too little. So they will, expect the government to pass a law maybe at $15 an hour. So companies are mandated by law to pay workers a certain salary. So that's the minimum wage. The next one is universal welfare entitlements. And I think we need to define this term very carefully. This is different from mere social spending, right? Every country's governments would spend money on welfare provisions. Governments subsidize healthcare. Governments, provide school vouchers wherever that we see. But universal welfare entitlements means that you get welfare as a right. Right? As a citizen, it's deemed as a universal human right for you to have access to certain goods and services. And usually people who believe in universal welfare, they would go to the point of saying that resources like healthcare, education, and even housing should either be heavily subsidized or be free at the point of purchase, which means that it will be funded by taxpayers and it will not cost anything for you to enjoy those services. So if you think about the National Health Service in the UK, that's a very good example of a welfare state system, right? And of course, redistribution comes in many forms, right? The first one is the income tax, whereby, a portion of your monthly income is taxed and you have to pay it to the state. And a new one that is, quite popular amongst many academics today, including some of the local Singaporean democratic socialist academics, is that of the wealth tax. the wealth tax, which is a bit different. So the wealth tax whereby the government will calculate the value of all your assets, including your houses, your stocks, your shares, your cars, right? And you'll be taxed a certain percentage of that value. So these are all different policies, but they're all interconnected because these are the policies that many young people today gravitate to at the ballot box. Many local left-wing academics are recommending this, which I think is very dangerous. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we actually wrote this book. But I think before we even talk about these policies and how they work, we have to think about what is inequality in the first place, right? And is that really something that merits, government intervention, right? So I think one of the key points that we make in the book is that there is a fundamental difference between inequality and poverty. They are two conceptually different things, and many people mix both of them up together. So inequality, simply put, is just that I don't have as much money as Jeff Bezos. I have one car, Jeff Bezos has maybe 10 Ferraris, right? That's inequality. Poverty means that I'm unable to meet my basic needs, right? So you can have one without the other. They are two very different things, right? You can have lots of inequality, but you have minimal level of poverty because almost everyone is able to meet the basic needs. It's just that there is a gap between the top and the bottom 10%. Yeah. Right? Poverty, on the other hand, is different, right? So it is possible to have a society whereby everyone is very equal. The differences in incomes and wealth is, quite minimal, but everyone is equally poor. The overall absolute level of wealth in the country is quite small. So I think this difference is actually very important. And there is a fundamental tension between both, right? So I think one of the key points that we like to highlight, I think Donovan would be able to share this further, is that if societies aim for too much equality, equal outcomes, equal incomes, or equal levels of wealth, what that means is that they will ask the government to implement these kind of policies that we just talked about, which are policies that would slow down economic growth. Policies that slow down economic growth means less jobs. Firms may have higher cost of production, they may have to shut down, right? And the overall level of wealth will shrink when we try to redistribute the pie into different slices, right? And on the other hand, when we try to increase the wealth and incomes for everyone, what we need are policies that promote economic growth, right? And when you promote economic growth, inevitably speaking, some will be richer and some will be poorer. So there is going to be a fundamental trade-off between inequality and poverty. And for me, I want to see the least well-off, the poor people, have a decent income, have good jobs, and be able to rise above their station. And that means economic growth. That does not mean the equalization of incomes and wealth.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good explanation of the general debate and kind of like the policy proposals that are implied by many of these arguments. But maybe one thing that I would add is that a lot of people, when they are thinking about income inequality, they tend to think in terms of what economists call fixed pie thinking, right? Where you have this much wealth in the economy, right? And now the only question that confronts us is a matter of distributing it in a fair proportion. And that's how a lot of these narratives tend to lead up with, right? They will say that 1%, the 1% owns 99% of the wealth and 99% of the population owns only 1% of the wealth. So there's a very static, it's a very static analysis because basically what you're saying is that you're freezing time and then, okay, this is unfair. Look, the rich has so much, let's split it. Let's make it more fair. And what essentially this analysis does, right, is that it does not take into account what Brian has just mentioned, which is economic growth, right? You are not concerned with how this pie of wealth might be enlarged over time. All you're concerned with is we have this much right now, and how do we split it? And I think as a question of moral philosophy, maybe there are some merits to asking that static question, but as economists, the sort of like the analysis, the rules of the analysis is slightly different, right? Because, okay, even if that's unfair, what does it mean if we split it too drastically? Would that hurt growth in the long run? And if it does, should we still split it? Is inequality a necessary evil? So I think that's the sort of like the dichotomy thinking between those who are hugely in favor of income inequality and those who tend to caution against it.
And I think this is where we need to analyze some of the statistics, the actual evidence and statistics about what's happening in the world today. So, I think it's quite common for us to hear that inequality is rising everywhere that we go, right? While that may be true in certain countries domestically, actually, if you measure inequality on a global level, global inequality is actually declined across the board over the last few decades. Right. So I think in the book, in chapter 6, we actually go through some of these statistics. If I may just cite one of it now. Research by Christoph Lackner from the World Bank and Branko Milanovic from the Luxembourg Income Studies Center showed that inequality when measured on a global rather than national level has actually declined across the board. Now, that may sound, very abstract, but what that simply means, right, is that there were many people, many countries in the world that became very rich over a very short time, over the last 30 to 40 years, namely China and India. So because poverty has been slashed dramatically, the incomes of the poorest have increased, that's the reason why global inequality is actually declining. So I think my question to viewers and listeners now is, what would you rather have? Would you rather have a society whereby everyone is equally poor? Or would you rather have a society whereby, yes, there's inequality, but there's opportunity, there's growth, there are jobs available, right? You are able to move from lower income groups to higher income groups, which is something that always happens when you allow economic growth to flourish.
Yeah, it's an empirical question ultimately. In fact, I personally, I don't even think that most of the arguments, right, that are taking place, I mean, they both tend to have the same endpoint in mind, which is to enrich the poor, right? The only question is how exactly do you get there? And the answer to the question you would have to get at by empirical analysis. That is, are the poor, are the least well-off actually getting better over time, right? And I think it's a bit of an understated point, right? So usually what they will do is they will look at these like quantitative measures of wealth and look at whether there's like an income trend or over time. What is that? Have you looked at some of these numbers in Singapore, Brian? I think maybe he's more qualified to comment on this.
That's right. So I've actually looked at some of these numbers and it's actually been presented in the book now. But first of all, one caveat now is that the numbers that we present, we are not tracking individual household differences. Okay, so that's actually one limitation which we have, which we acknowledge. But then again, no one in Singapore has also done that because it's difficult to track like individual households and see the changes of their incomes over a period of time, right? So only when you do that will you have a true measurement of whether specific groups of people remain poor over a period of time. But what we did was we just did, a general, comparison, right, in 2009 and 10 years later. And what I found is that the top 10% of Singaporean households, they got richer by 36.58%, okay? But the bottom 50% and the bottom 10% of households in Singapore got richer, but richer faster than the rich got rich, right? So the bottom 10% had an increase of their income by 50.26%. And the bottom 50% of households, which means the poorer half of Singapore, got richer by 57.85%. So this whole idea of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is complete bollocks. It's complete bollocks in Singapore. It's ridiculous.
And one thing I might add is that these figures are only taking into account like quantifiable wealth income, right? So for example,
right.
there are many kinds of so why I always stress that you can't think about income inequality without thinking about economic development and economic growth. The two are interlinked. And so for example, like if for example, like 20 years ago, before we had smartphones and Uber, if I wanted to hail a cab, I would have to go down like 15 minutes earlier. I have to stand out on the pavement and spend time hailing a cab. But today, or I can sit in the comfort of my home, I can book a cab and then go down when the cab comes, right? So that, in essence, is a wealth gain. because I'm able to do more with less effort, with less time, right? But how would you actually quantify that? See, that's something that's very tricky to quantify. And also, like if you look at like television sets, to 30 years ago a television set, and 30 years to today, right, a television set, probably the average household might spend something like 30% of their 30 to 40% of their monthly income to buy a TV back then. Today, because television sets are much cheaper, I'm able to get it with something like 10 to 15% of my income. So see, that's also a wealth gain in effect. And how exactly do you measure that? And also don't forget that the television sets 30 years ago and today, right, are drastically different in quality and variety, right? And all these are very hard to quantify. So even though we only look at like the quantifiable measurements, right, and we already find that the least well-off in society, the middle class, are in fact getting richer, this doesn't even take into account the unquantifiable wealth gains, and they are very, very widespread.
So I guess, you know, a lot of these activists, they have been advocating some form of minimum wage. I think James Lim, he kind of mentioned this idea in Parliament a few weeks ago. So what do you think about this? Like, what do you think governments should do anything about inequality?
So maybe Donovan, you know, I think recently, you know, you shared something about the minimum wage. Maybe could you share with us, Donovan, about what is the economic consensus about the minimum wage? Is it something that, you know, economists dispute about, that somehow, you know, it's too simplistic to say that minimum wage causes unemployment?
Yeah. So maybe like approaching the minimum wage topic, this is a very politically contentious topic, right? Just because of the divide in opinion between policymakers and not so much between economists. So I think in approaching the minimum wage debate, typically the way it tends to be framed is like, do you want to increase the income by setting a price a floor? Do you want to increase the income of blue-collar workers? And then the people who are arguing against this notion will tend to say that if you do that, what you're going to see is you're going to eliminate jobs. You're going to incentivize employers to fire their workers because they're just not going to pay that much for a worker. And kind of like when you look at the economic literature, and there are very extensive literature reviews done on this, I think there's across the board, there is a strong consensus that economists think that the minimum wage is a bad idea. Maybe slightly less of a consensus that there might be a bit more of a divide in opinion at a low minimum wage, right? But at something like $15, which is the sort of the rallying cry of many top tier, not top tier, but like prominent politicians like Bernie Sanders and the Workers' Party and SDP, they are all going for the $15 mark. And at that mark, I think it's very clear that most economists think that it's a bad idea. And there's just no way that you can have that while at the same time maintaining economic productivity, let alone grow it.
I think what is very appalling about James Lim is that he has been cherry picking a lot of the evidence, you know, from what he calls economic studies to support his conclusions about the minimum wage. So we acknowledge that indeed it's true that there are some studies who do show that minimum wage do not cause unemployment, which is the concern that most critics of minimum wage actually have, like us. We acknowledge that completely. But then again, the overwhelming bulk of the evidence points the opposite direction. And in fact, the most influential, I would say, study published by MIT Press comes to an unambiguous conclusion, which we actually document in our book. And I will just read this sentence out. A comprehensive review of evidence on the effect of minimum wages on employment, skills, wage and income distributions, and longer-term labor market outcomes concludes that the minimum wage is not a good policy tool. So I think that's the first point to know. But of course, we need to not just look at, statistics, because different people can pluck out different statistics, right? So I think we need to go back to first principles to understand, basic economic principles, okay? So the idea is that incentives matter. right? If you do not believe that incentives matter, you cannot call yourself an economist. This is a very basic core precept, okay? Incentives matter simply means that when something is more expensive, you will buy less of it, or you will want to have less of it, right? So when you try to put a minimum wage, you are just going to increase the cost of labor, and firms and bosses and employers will want to reduce the demand for labor, right? If workers are so expensive, I want to hire less of them, right? And then of course, people like James Lim are going to say, oh, but we still see, a lot of workers being employed in cities where there's minimum wage, right? And actually, workers did not actually reduce the number of workers. Well, okay, fine, that may be true, but that does not mean that incentives suddenly do not matter anymore. It still matters, right? Because even if employers may not fire the workers immediately, they may still cut back on the benefits that these employees receive in other areas. For example, the number of days of leave they get, medical benefits, healthcare benefits. Incentives matter. When the government arbitrarily makes workers more expensive to employers, workers suffer because employers, rightly and naturally so, want to reduce the demand for them.
Yeah, so I think one of the very common, when I was writing on this like a few months ago, one of the very common criticisms that was like leveled against anti-minimum wage folks like myself and Brian is that you tend to you can easily find a research paper where they will show that, hey, look, minimum wage was raised in, say, Seattle, and jobs weren't really lost and jobs weren't really eliminated. So hey, look, your argument falls apart, right? The minimum wage works. You're just a ideological neoliberal free market guy. But again, like as Brian mentioned, right, is the unemployment, and I think this is a bit of an understated point in the debate, is that unemployment is just one way by which the minimum wage will actually incur costs. If I don't fire my workers, I might reduce their benefits, I might pass the cost on to consumers, right? Maybe McDonald's will say, hey, look what the government wants to set a minimum wage. Okay, I'm not going to fire you guys because the unions don't let me, but I'm going to raise like the price of my beef patties. And that means that your McSpicy meal is going to cost like 10 cents more, 20 cents more, right? So that in effect is still a cost being incurred, right? And there are many other ways by which the cost might be passed on. It might be passed on to a different industry, for example. So if like the law says fast food workers, all of you are going to get a $15 minimum wage, maybe the McDonald's and KFC is going to say, okay, we still need to maintain our revenues, so why not let's charge our suppliers more? And these suppliers are going to come from an adjacent industry outside of the fast food industry. And then those workers in those industries are going to feel the cost of the minimum wage, right? But of course, most empirical studies, they don't actually, when they look at one industry, they don't, it's very difficult to look at so many industries in totality. So is disingenuous for, I think, a lot of politicians and policymakers to try and make the argument that the minimum wage is costless. And some even go as far as saying that it's going to encourage some kind of economic growth, which it really is a preposterous notion, right? And yeah, I think so. Again, it comes back to what Brian was saying about first principles. You need to start from you need to look at what economic theory is, and then apply the theory consistently across the board.
Okay, so you mentioned two books in particular. First is Donald Lowe's Hard Choices, and then the other one is Tu Yuyan's book, What Inequality Looks Like. Could you explain, like, I guess your take on their viewpoints, and also, yeah.
So I think we need to understand who Mr. Donald Loui is. So he was previously a professor at Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He's considered one of Singapore's top public intellectuals, but he is now been operating out of Hong Kong, right? He has written numerous books, and I would say that our book really is a response to his book, which is called Hard Choices: Challenging a Singapore Consensus. And I would say his entire book rests mainly on the first chapter. That I would say is his main, thrust, of the whole book. And this chapter is titled The Four Myths of Inequality, the four myths. And in this chapter, he argues that the PEP government has perpetuated four myths, which are essentially wrong. And he uses that to conclude that therefore we need more minimum wage, we need the welfare state, we need more redistribution, right? So what are these 4 myths that he has accused the Singapore government of perpetuating? Let me read it out for all of us. First, inequality is a necessary counterpart of economic dynamism and competitiveness. That's a myth, according to him. The PAP is wrong to say that, therefore, we need more redistribution. Second myth, the best way to help the poor is to help the rich. That is a myth. That's wrong. So therefore, we need redistribution. The third one, inequality is not really a problem as long as there isn't extreme poverty and incomes are rising across the board. That's a myth according to him. Therefore, we need redistribution. The fourth one, since pay is tied to ability, rising inequality is simply the result of increasing differences in people's ability. That's a myth, and therefore we need redistribution. Now, what is our take on this? I would say that the way he has presented these points, right, is actually very disingenuous and very misleading, because he uses half-truths over here, right? It's partly true but partly wrong, right? So let's take the first one. Inequality is a necessary counterpart of economic dynamism and competitiveness. Well, it's true and it's untrue at the same time, right? So we are not saying that inequality is the driver of economic growth, that inequality is a necessary part, of a good society, of an economically healthy society. But what we are saying is that if we allow people to be free, to pursue their own plans, to make their own choices, to work in jobs they want to work, right? Naturally speaking, some will be poorer than others, some will make more money than others, right? And that's a natural fact of life, right? If I want to make everyone, the same, then I'm actually gonna have to force people to make the same choices, right? To work the same jobs. So it is indeed true, yes, when we have a healthy economy, when there's economic growth, there will be some level of inequality. But that is a reflection of people's differences. That is a reflection of the free choices that people make. And I don't see what's wrong with that.
Right. And just very quickly, right, off the top of my head, I have recounted many times where PAP politicians, Lee Kuan Yew himself included, that have acknowledged that inequality, that the Singapore society, if we want to advance into the age of globalization, we need to learn to tolerate inequality. So that statement in itself strikes me as casting inequality as a necessary evil, and not so much as Donald Low is presenting it as a driver and like a sort of like a causation factor.
Yeah, and moving on to the second myth which he alleges is that the best way to help the poor is to help the rich. That's complete rubbish. That's complete rubbish, because there is no self-respecting development economists, or, we don't even talk about free marketers like me, people who actually study economic development at a very high level, economists who are experts in this topic, who make trips to Africa and all that, who study all the different causal drivers. No one would say, if we want to help the poor, we need to help Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates have another $1 billion. No one has ever said that, right? So I think what we are saying, and what many economists are saying, is that if you want to help the poor and the rich, in fact, anyone, you need to have an economy that rewards entrepreneurship, that rewards wealth creation, that rewards business growth, that allows people to get a job, to earn an income, and to make a living, right? And that means economic freedom. Countries that are economically free have higher economic growth and less poverty, right? So yes, so it is true that we want policies like cutting taxes, to have less regulation on businesses, right? To have minimal social safety net system. It is true that these are the policies that we advocate, but that does not mean that it's pro-rich, right? It's not trickle-down, economics, which is a very common, a pejorative, that they, people on the left like to use against us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what like Donald Low is trying to tease out with this second myth, right? He's trying to say that, oh look, if you are advocating for tax cuts, in some way you just want to help the rich, because obviously the ones who will get taxed the hardest are the most wealthy. And this whole trickle-down economics narrative, right? I think it's just so politicized to the point where it's just so meaningless, right? Like the idea that you were gonna have. So the argument is that if you want tax cuts, you just want to give more money to the rich, and the rich will invest in more businesses and properties, and then over time, the wealth will trickle down to the poor. But if you look at the way, just using very common sense logic, right? If you look at the way the economy actually works, right, it's trickle up rather than down. If I have $5 million, I start a business and I want to hire, say, 20 workers, right? Immediately, I'm going to have to start paying them wages. And businesses don't turn a profit or until like several years later. So what is this? Where did this notion come from that like I'm gonna like fatten my own pockets in the immediate short term, and then like my workers, the so-called lower and middle classes, they are going to get the money way later after the wealth has trickled down to them. It is in fact the exact opposite, right? I have to pay them right now and then, unless of course you find a worker that's crazy enough to say that, oh, you can pay me 1 year later. Well, obviously not, right? And as the entrepreneur, I'm taking such a huge risk. How am I going to know that my business venture doesn't fail? If it fails, it's all on me, you know? Like none of the workers are going to face the repercussions. They may lose their job, sure, but I'm going to take on massive debt if I fail my business venture. So like the whole notion of like trickle-down economics, I mean, like I don't even remember a single famous economist who actually advocated this so-called
It's complete
theory.
rubbish. Yeah,
It's a very politicized term, honestly. Yeah, and I guess my quick brain note to like people who believe in this theory is that if you, it's fine if you believe in tax cuts. It's fine if you believe in wealth taxes, but you need to shift your argumentation away from this so-called trickle-down theory, because it's not even a thing in between economists.
And I think what you have highlighted is the shocking lack of real economic rigor in a lot of the writings of these academics in the Singapore context, right? And moving on to the next one, which I think is even more shocking, is the idea that inequality is not a problem as long as there isn't extreme poverty and incomes are rising across the board. Well, yes and no. The response, yes and no. It is true to some extent that why should I be concerned about how many cars that Jeff Bezos has, as long as I have a decent life, as long as I'm able to earn an income and my incomes and my life is actually improving over time. So in that respect, this statement is actually correct, but it's not fully correct, right? Because economists like us, okay, and I study this in a very in-depth way, right? So I think the answer is, how is the inequality generated, right? If inequality is a result of the free choices of people to exchange goods and services, then yes, the overall result may not be a bad thing. But many times in many developed countries, the inequality that we see is because of what we call rent-seeking behavior, which is where firms and certain business people, they get special privileges, special favors, because they're close political connections with the government. And because of that, they get rich at the expense of everyone else. And that is wrong. That is not inequality that results from the free market. That is unjust inequality. And we totally acknowledge that. We completely acknowledge that. But this difference, right, this distinction that we drew is completely absent in Donald Lou's analysis, or should I say lack of analysis.
Okay, so I guess the other book that you guys pointed talked about was Triggerdown. This is what inequality looks like. So could you explain, I guess, some of the main themes of the book, and like what you agree with, what you disagree with?
I think first of all, we need to know that Kuan Yew, she is a sociologist from NTU. So because of that, she studies the topic in a rather unique way, different from most mainstream economists. And I think that's a strength of the book. It's actually a strength of the book. So she uses a common approach that sociologists use, which is ethnography, to study the subject, which is inequality in Singapore, right? So that means that she spends time actually living and interacting with poor people in Singapore, and she writes this book to document their struggles, to document the plight of these very disadvantaged segments of Singapore. And I think when you read this book, any person with a heart and a brain who reads this book, you will feel that, you know what, they are living really, a sad lives. So for sure, I think she's right on many counts that there are many poor people in Singapore, and we need to find ways to give them a better life, right? So that's a great strength of the book. So don't get us wrong, such that we are dismissing the book offhand. That's not the case. But I think there are certain problems as well, right? Which is that, even though she claims that she's not, a policy analyst or an economist, she inadvertently still makes some recommendations on the kind of government policies that she favors, right? And in certain parts of the book, even though that's not the main focus, she recommends universal welfare state. Surprise, surprise. Just like other, academics like Donald Loui, right? So countries like Scandinavia, right? The Nordic countries where healthcare, where education, housing is heavily subsidized or is free, right? So I think she is strong in her ethnographic investigation of the phenomenon of inequality, but not so good when it comes to the policy recommendations that she draws. And I think what is unique about our argument is that we actually flip her argument around on its head. Because we argue that using her own first principles, we are able to derive a very different conclusion from her, right? So she uses ethnography and she comes to the conclusion that we need more redistribution, we need welfare state. But actually, we can also use ethnography, we can agree with her methodology and come to a very different conclusion, which is free markets and limited government. How are we able to do that, right? Because rather than asking, this is what inequality looks like, we could say, this is what entrepreneurship looks like. This is what free market capitalism looks like. This is what hard work, and self-reliance and meritocracy looks like. So I can do an ethnographic study on the merits of the market process, right? On the merits of capitalism, and an ethnography of how entrepreneurship creates wealth opportunities for the least well-off, right? Which is not something that she has done. So we flip the argument on its head.
Yeah. So I think, broadly speaking, I agree with what Brian has said. But maybe one point that I'll add is you just kind of stress like where we actually agree with her book. And so if you look at a lot of arguments that are for wealth redistribution, typically the kind of mold that it tends to take a shape of, right, is that they will say that, look, people are poor, and if you don't give them some kind of redistributive incomes, these people are going to stay poor forever. Therefore, they will have the state has to take on some kind of role to transfer money to them, right? So this very standard kind of argument, it takes a form of like looking at poverty as an account balance, where if the account is empty, let's just top it up, right? And if you look at sociologists who have studied poverty, who have studied inequality, let me scratch that. So let's not conflate the two, right? They look at sociologists who have studied poverty, they actually go and live with these people, and what they find is that a lot of these people are poor because they are unable to assimilate into the economy, into the broader economy, right? And for the number one reason is mental illnesses. People who are socially reclusive, right? Second reason might be something like they come from environments which are very unstable. There's like ridden with crime, ridden with like drugs. So you see, the point here is that there is value of sociology in studying poverty, because economists with their statistical regressions, they cannot look at the circumstances that are in these environments of poor people. So here's where sociology comes in. You look at what are the circumstances, and then you can craft policy that better addresses these circumstances, rather than defaulting on a very intellectually lazy position, which is that, oh, look, these people are poor, tax the rich, give them like a bunch of money, right? Which doesn't help them at all, by the way, right? Because if the person is unable to find a job because of like mental illnesses, giving them money, right, you're just gonna make the problem. I mean, you're just gonna prolong the problem, so to speak, right? And so the best example of this is you look at, just very quickly, right? You look at, say, foreign aid. The UN, the World Bank, they have been giving millions and billions of money to African countries, and this has not gotten them rich. Why? Not because these people in African countries are like lazy or inherently stupid or whatever like that, right? It's because they have corrupt institutions, they have rent-seeking institutions that prevents the economy from developing and getting rich. So you take that thinking and then you bring it back to like poor people in society. It's the same reason you can't just funnel money into them. It doesn't help poor people. So that's where the value of sociology comes in. But what Qiu Yuan does is that she starts with that analysis and then she jumps like 10 steps, which aren't explained, and then just sort of lands on the conclusion that, oh, look, we need redistributive mechanisms and policies, which is just, I think, a huge hole in the book, which is a very well-written book and very emotionally heart-wrenching book, but wrong in any case.
So this really reminds me of a quote that I remember from former Education Minister Ong Ye Kung. So he said that handouts and welfare is not dignity. Self-reliance is dignity, right? So if you think about how people who earn a decent income, who became rich, none of them actually did so through welfare, right? By being a state dependent. That's never been a case in history. Right? It's always true what people call earned success. When you earn something of your own, when you succeed on your own merits, I think that is how we give people a sense of dignity and a sense of achievement.
So I think one of the things that a lot of, I guess, activists have been pushing for is wealth tax. So you've kind of explained what wealth tax was previously. So what do you think about activism surrounding increase of wealth tax?
I would say, it's not so much just activists. It's a lot of responsibility comes from a single individual, and that's Donald Loui again. Okay, so if I may just raise an article that he wrote not too long ago, actually on multiple platforms, including Today Online. It's called "The Curious Case of Missing Wealth Taxes in Singapore." So if I may just read some parts of this article, he writes, "It should come as no surprise to anyone that budget statement of government did not introduce any new taxes on wealth in Singapore, nor raise the rates of the few existing wealth taxes. The missing debate on wealth taxes is not just curious, it is also unhealthy. As Singapore ages and if economic growth slows, wealth inequality will become more pronounced, even as the demands on social spending rise. It is therefore important to consider whether and how wealth in Singapore should be taxed. Should. So the word should means that he is recommending a policy, or at least suggesting that it is a good idea. But is that really a good idea? In fact, I would say the wealth tax is one of the more extreme policies. Okay, in fact, I think even the Singapore government who is starting to fight inequality, they may be raising a little bit of income taxes, but wealth tax is something that I think most cannot really accept because it's quite extreme. But if we look at the wealth tax as practiced in Europe, actually it's not new. Okay, many countries have done a wealth tax, but they have renounced it. They have since moved away from it because they realize the disastrous effects of the wealth tax. So I'm not sure whether individuals like Donald Loui, these academics in Singapore, they are aware of this economic evidence. In fact, if I may just rake up some of this evidence, the number of European countries with annual wealth taxes actually has fallen from 12 countries in 1990 to just around 3 today. Ireland imposed and then repealed its wealth tax in the 1970s, right? And if I may just highlight some specific examples, especially from the Scandinavian countries, which is supposedly the beacon of egalitarianism, the beacon of welfare states, right? Let's look at Sweden, right? Sweden. Sweden repealed its wealth tax in 2007 as it became clear it was driving business people, such as the founder of IKEA Furnitures, out of the country. An analysis by Swedish economists, found that wealth tax revenues were declining as people could with impunity evade the tax by taking appropriate measures. Sweden has low property taxes and it abolished its inheritance tax in 2004. What about Finland, which is another country that supposedly has lots of wealth redistribution, wealth taxes, and generous government spending? Well, they abolished its wealth tax in 2006, a reform which was motivated by the fact that the tax they found had an unfair impact on enterprises and the poor, and provided many possibilities to evade. And this is research done by the European Commission.
Yeah, so I think it's wrong on both on an empirical level and on a theoretical level, right? So yeah, I think the evidence on like wealth taxes I think is irrefutably clear that it has been harmful to many countries. Over the past 3 decades, so many developed nations have abandoned their wealth taxes. If I'm not mistaken, the only country that still has a wealth tax in place is Switzerland, and even then it's not very high, right? Yeah.
Okay. So is there anything else that you guys would like to add before we finish this discussion?
I would say, the most important thing for listeners and viewers is it's not about what we are against, it's about what we are for, right? So, in this talk, we mentioned we are against many of these policies. We are against some of the, rightly so, justifiably so, the lack of economic analysis by many of these Singaporean scholars and academics. But I think what we are for is empowerment of the poor. Okay, I believe in empowerment of the poor. I want to see poor people have a decent life and be able to, have a standard of living that most of us in Singapore is able to enjoy. The question is how we are able to do that, right? How we are able to do it. So we are not really debating about the intentions, but about the methodology. Right? And I would say the best way to allow people to have a decent life is really economic freedom. I come back to free market capitalism. It sounds very ideological, but it's true, right? Because free market capitalism, no system can hold a candle to it, right? Through history and across time, across space, you see that when people have the opportunity to make wealth, to earn a job, to earn an income, to work in the labor market, to create businesses, people are enriched. People rise up of the depths of poverty. And that's, I think, why we write about liberalism unveiled, because we believe that this can also create economic opportunities for the least well-off in Singapore. It's not a defense of the 1%.
Right. And the best example of being able to look at that is you take the poorest person in Singapore and you compare them to poor people in other developed nations, not even developing ones yet. Just look at other developed nations and you will see that the poorest person in Singapore, as unfortunate as his circumstances are, he is still able to have access to very quality schooling, quality healthcare if he needs it to. So the country is rich, and Singapore is rich for a good reason. It's because we have, broadly speaking, for a long time we have adhered to a very laissez-faire economic system. So again, the point is that if you can spill your sort of like your rhetoric and your arguments all day about how tax cuts are fattening the rich, the pockets of the rich, and hurting the poor, but empirically you just don't see that happening at all. The poor in Singapore are so much better off than the poor elsewhere, and it's a system that is theoretically correct, empirically right, and morally humane.
Okay, thank you. So, Ryan and Donovan, it has been a pleasure discussing with you the inequality in Singapore society today, and thank you for your time and insight. So, the link to the book will be in the YouTube down bar and also in the Spotify episode info. So, this has been